Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
In looking for new investors, new markets, American business has increasingly looked to the Far East. In fact, what has been offered by Japan, Korea, China is the stuff that economic dreams are made of. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the Far East and the relationship of America and American cities, Muncie in the Midwest in particular, and how it's pursuing economic development with the help of some sister city in the Far East. Our panelists are John Rouse, producer of Public Affairs Roundtable and a member of Ball State's political science faculty, Rob O'Brien, vice president for economic development with the Muncie, Delaware County Chamber of Commerce, Barbara Underwood, assistant superintendent of Mount Pleasant Community Schools in Yorktown, west of Muncie, and John Bowles, president of Star Financial Bank and chairman of the Muncie, Delaware County Chamber of Commerce. John, it's, I guess the Far East is something new, something different. It's been mysterious, but now it's very much an area for a business opportunity for America.
Yeah, I think what is occurring around the world is that the boundaries are going away. So economic boundaries, educational boundaries, as we think of what has happened in the last 5 years with glasnost and perestroika from the Soviet Union, we see that the boundaries, the national boundaries, nationalism still has a tremendous impact, but the boundaries of economic and political nationalism, even cultural nationalism, are dropping. And so as we live in a changing world, we have to look at how we overcome boundaries.
Rob, Muncie and Delaware County aren't unique in looking to the Far East. Certainly we've sold to and bought from Japan for a number of years, but then we're dealing with Korea when we talk about China. It must present, in terms of economic development, a whole new area of opportunity.
Well, there are several areas that hold some potential, Larry. Certainly in Indiana, the most public and well-known is that of the direct investment, primarily of the Japanese, into Indiana, and particularly in the automotive segment. But there is movement underway to look for more joint ventures, to look for more export of product from Indiana into the Far East markets. The Far East countries, particularly Japan and Korea, are making an effort to look for opportunities to import products from the Midwest. I think significant to that is the recent agreement between the state of Indiana and the Japan External Trade Organization to put a JETRO office in with the Indiana Department of Commerce to help promote sales of Indiana products to the Japanese marketplace.
Barbara, people are saying, what are we doing with an educator on this program? Education obviously plays a role. In Yorktown, at Yorktown High School, you'll be offering not just the usual French and Spanish and a little German, but Japanese. How'd that happen? Why'd that happen?
Well, it happened because we were somewhat adventuresome a couple of years ago by being one of 15 school corporations in the state to be awarded a grant through Earlham College in the Department of Education. This has been a 3-year project. We were in phase 3, the last 5 schools. And our commitment to this project is to improve international education in our school corporation. A very concrete outcome of that will be adding Japanese language, formal study of Japanese language at the high school next year, as well as Japanese language and culture experiences for middle school and elementary. So I got terribly interested in that and also spent 3 weeks in Japan last summer as part of that project. So my work that I've done with the chamber, with the mayor's office, has grown out of our school corporation's interest because we think that we can cooperate and we know that the business community can help us, and we also think we can help the business community in Muncie and Delaware County.
John, this obviously has to be a coordinated effort. I mean, you're talking about education, you're talking about involvement of the city, you're talking about involvement of the, with the Chamber of Commerce, with the business community. How do you coordinate an effort like that to get the desired results?
Well, the Chamber of Commerce does have a formal Sister Cities program, and hopefully it's being somewhat coordinated through that program. And the mayor's office, and Barb's involved in that also. All of us are trying to bring all of those efforts together. I think up until this point, Muncie's only city-sister relationship has been with a city in Taiwan, and it's been more of a city government to city government type relationship. We strongly believe that we really need to broaden that if we're going to have true sister city relationships, to bring in all segments of the community, the commercial segment, the educational segment, as well as the city government segment.
What are we trying to do? Just get a foothold, open a door, establish one link to lead to something bigger? Is that the design of it?
I think at this point we're really exploring what our possibilities are. As John said, the world in a very short period of time has just changed tremendously. And it's really a pretty small world, and it's one world instead of a whole bunch of countries. And we have to start realizing that and being ready to react that way, that it is one world and it's one marketplace. And we have to be ready to react that way, and we have to make sure that our own community is ready to react that way.
I think that one of the perceptions perhaps here in Indiana is that the Far East, especially the countries that all of us have been to, Korea and Japan, really don't have that much influence upon Indiana in a way, or reverse, our country doesn't have that much influence inside Korea or Japan. What happened after World War II, of course, was that, as many say, was that this country won the peace but lost the war. In other words, the defensive relationship between our country and Japan is such that Japan puts very little into defense spending. Also, since 1953, the presence of American military forces in Japan and Korea put great cultural input, so to speak, from America into those countries. So what is occurring, I think, is that the relationship between our country and Korea and Japan is changing. It's changing economically, and at some point in time, we will be taking military establishments out of those countries. What will return will be educational and economic investments.
And how do we benefit?
Well, perhaps going back a little bit, the difference in culture, while it's gradually lessening, is still very much a concern on both sides. And understanding the differences in culture and building a relationship of understanding and trust is very important, particularly to the people in the Far East, by looking for some very specific relationships with individual communities where you have an opportunity to create that people-to-people understanding. From that, opportunities seem to spring forward if you look at the history of these broad-based sister city programs that have been successful in other communities. We learned quite a bit in both countries. We found in Japan that the city that we visited with quite extensively, while somewhat larger in size, is strikingly similar to Delaware County in terms of the number of people employed in manufacturing, the number of retailers, the economic base in terms of U.S. dollars or yen, whichever way you want to convert it, were surprisingly similar. They had a lot of the same concerns: an aging workforce, worker retraining. We found out, and Barbara might want to elaborate on that, that while there's a great disparity in the educational systems, they do some things very well that we might want to look at closer. We also do some things very well, particularly in addressing the needs of those people who have typically not been in the mainstream of the education system, the special education people that the Japanese system hasn't been able to grapple with that yet. So we have something to offer them. The real idea is to find ways in which both can benefit. And from that, you build a relationship of trust, and you begin seeing that ideas and opportunities just kind of start popping up at that point. And just having a contact that you can call and say, "Did you know that? We have someone who needs this," or that begins the cycle.
We've got some things to learn from the Japanese in education, Barbara?
I think the hardest lesson that we have to the most important lesson that we have to learn is the hardest to implement. I wish I could have returned and said that the longer school day and the state-mandated curriculum and many of those very concrete factors were the answer to our problems. And unfortunately, what I found out was the commitment that total society has to education seems to make the difference. And there's not easy solutions to that problem that we have, although they do share some common concerns. And I think that as we read about Japanese education as the utopian system, they would not view it that way, and they're very interested in our system. And international education is a real major thrust for them right now. And in the cities that we visit in Kumagaya this year and where I was in Morioka last year, they have American teachers coming in, spending a year because of their interest in some of the same kinds of things. So they have their difficulties and their battles, although they have a very successful system in terms of achievement.
I think an important thing in your curriculum is that, as you mentioned, you're not just going to teach the language, that if we're going to deal with Japanese or the Koreans or the Chinese as our economic partners, we have to have an understanding of something more than just their language.
We see Japan and Japanese as a model for what could happen with any country and any culture and any language. It just so happens it's one that is certainly in the forefront economically. But what's happening to expand our international perspective goes far beyond studying Japan and Japanese, but that's probably the part that gains the most attention. But what we want for our students, and I think every school corporation wants, is for those youngsters to have a broader perspective and be able to compete in a world that we're not sure exactly what it will be, but we know it will expand far beyond what our world was when we were that age.
Barbara, if I can pick up on a couple points you made. You know, if you don't know another nation's language, you don't know their culture. And I think it's increasingly important. And the second point is competition. Whether you're in banking or in whatever field, you got to be able to compete in this changing world, and therefore it's incumbent that our kids and us too know as much about foreign languages so we can compete. We have to know about the country. For example, Japan and Korea are very homogeneous nations. They're very centralized. I found, in a sense, that Japan was very regulated. For example, our airline industry here is very deregulated. We have choices. When it comes to that in Japan, we had fewer choices. So I think we have to learn about their culture. We have to learn how to compete because, as John was saying earlier, competition is keen because the boundaries are dropping, and we have to be able to mix it up, so to speak, around the world.
You know, John, though, when I left Muncie, expecting to see great differences in everything that we saw. And the truth of the matter is, I was struck not by the differences in our cultures and in the plant visitations and the school visitations that we made, but I was struck more by the similarities, which surprised me somewhat.
For example, what?
Well, my purpose, the reason I went was probably more specific than the rest. I did go to with a specific purpose in mind in making a personal call on a company that we've had negotiations on a plant location site here in Muncie with. And we had the opportunity to tour probably 7 or 8 of this firm's plants in Japan. And I was really struck by the similarities to plants that I visit from time to time in Muncie or in Delaware County. Not with the differences, but with the similarities. Some of the plants that we visited were small shops, very similar to a lot of the small shops in Muncie. Some of the plants that we visited were high-tech, brand new plants. One in particular was a Hitachi steel plant that was high-tech and modern and computerized and clean in an industry that's not particularly clean. But again, when I walked in, I didn't have the feeling I was in a foreign factory. I walked in and said, hey, it's a factory just like we have at home. And the same thing was true in the smaller shops, right down to the calendar that was up over the tool maker's wall that had a pin-up girl on it. I felt very much as what you'd see here.
Have we learned from them, or they learned from us, or how did that work?
I think they've definitely learned from us. The question is, have we learned from them? See, I think as you look at Korea, land size probably about like Indiana, 43 million people. How many in Indiana? 5 million people. If you look at Japan, land size, 5% of the land size in America. How many people? 120 million people. I mean, these two societies have to, in the last 40 years, have to get their acts together. And so they have to compete. I think, in a sense, the societies there are not as open as ours is, certainly, and they're very polite people. I mean, the Japanese are always bowing constantly, and everything's very polite. So in a sense, you have trouble getting around the politeness to get to the real facts of the thing. But I think that they have definitely learned from us. Look at their economic successes over the last years.
But with the other side of the coin, with education, they learned from us a few years ago.
I know.
But they've adapted better to their system, and we're still doing what they learned from us several years ago, and I don't think that we've made the kind of strides that they have to keep pace with the needs of their society. I think there's some things they want to learn from us and some things they don't, and the other way around, because societies are very different. And I really think it's so important when we approach this through education that we not only look at it from the standpoint of how can we learn from one another, but how can we respect those differences. And the trip I made last summer and again this summer, I think, are so special because you're not tourists, but rather you're interacting with people. And I had 2 weeks of fairly intense training or indoctrination, whichever the case may be, so that when we visited Japan for the first time, we looked at it not through our eyes, but through theirs, and learned to accept that there are differences. And when we work together with those differences and not try to make us all alike. If we can learn that as adult learners, which a group of us did last summer, that the hope for our students to approach it in that way certainly greater.
I think we somewhat have an inferiority complex sometimes when we sit here and think about ourselves and where we are right now in the world economy. And I think when we were, in particular in Japan, where we were able to talk more about that, I think they had the same kind of inferiority complex that we had. They thought that there were a lot of things that we do better than they do, and our concerns were what they did better than we do. And so it was kind of an interesting group of conversations we had when they didn't really understand us, thinking why there were some things that we didn't do very well, because they don't have that view of us at all. And we had the same kind of thing that how could you not think you're doing great? Because we think you are, you know, and it was kind of interesting. And I think another point, John, that you mentioned the size of both countries and the economic impact that both countries are having on the world and their populations. But it was very obvious to me that both Japan and Korea have stressed their infrastructure to the point of being very, very thin. And while we have a lot of discussions here about the condition of our infrastructure, it certainly is far superior to what I saw in either Japan or Korea, and they're just starting to grapple with problems of pollution and air quality and water quality and traffic problems that we've really handled significantly better than they have at this point.
I think part of their motivation, when we look at how dynamic their society is, or as we perceive it to be, was you build up a kind of idea of things from tiny newspaper articles and comments on the street and that type of thing. But one comment that struck me was in Japan was made by one of our hosts who pointed out that they really work hard. They really do export a lot because they need the monetary return, because they import a tremendous amount, and they import a tremendous amount of food. They are the #1 agricultural importer as far as the U.S. farm economy is concerned. But this is a country that has, as our host pointed out, a 3-week supply of food. If America ever shut the door on them, they would have 3 weeks of food, and then what do they do? And they're very keenly aware that the size of the United States, the population, everything that we have makes it very easy for us to isolate ourselves if we would so desire, but they can't do that. And so they have to constantly work at being leaders in the marketplace, at having products that are going to be purchased around the world in order to sustain their economy. Korea is in much the same position. They are a small landmass, as John pointed out. They have a lot of population that is, even with their small landmass, made even smaller by the number of mountains that are in Korea. So they have a lot of people in a very tiny space. They do not have much arable land. They don't have a lot of mineral resources when it comes to what we would think of as used in heavy industry. So they have to import all of those things, and consequently they have to export and be leaders in the world market. What they do if they're going to have enough in their economy to be able to buy the food that they need. And so in many respects, their striving is driven by some very simple needs. And they're not necessarily the needs that we have in this country. And they are were just overwhelmed. They couldn't even grapple with the scope of agriculture in this country. We had 2 people from the Farm Bureau who were constantly telling them about the size of the farms here and the size of the equipment and the range of products that are grown across the United States, and they just couldn't grapple with that. It was completely beyond their comprehension.
When the average size of a farm in Korea was something like 1.5 acres, they had a hard time understanding a farmer that could farm 3,000 acres. I mean, there was no comprehension of what we were talking about.
Yeah, I think we have looked at their strengths, and they look at our strengths. And I think in terms of pollution, for example, Seoul, South Korea is one of the most vibrant cities I've ever been to. One interesting thing is the number of crosses. I think Christianity, the invasion of Christianity into South Korea in terms of the Protestant ethic has had some impact. It was just amazing the number of neon crosses you saw throughout each city in Korea. I think also in terms of the pollution with automobiles, Seoul, South Korea has an automobile problem like no other city I've ever seen. And they're adding automobiles like crazy. I mean, here, and number 3, they're still under a military problem because they face a real military situation from the north. And also, I can understand why Eisenhower now stopped at the 38th parallel. You simply cannot get tanks any farther north because of the real mountainous area. Very difficult area to fight a war. So I think in terms of Korea and also Japan, they look at our strengths, we look at their strengths, and we play down the weaknesses of each other.
It was also very striking to me in some of the industrial visitations that we made, all of the parts and pieces that we saw being manufactured for what we thought were American-made products and American nameplates, pieces that you would recognize as being from a particular business machine in my case, and knowing full well what the nameplate was that went on there, where it came from.
The military aspect brings up, of course, a great historical irony that we're talking about sister cities and we're talking about relationships, economic and whatnot. With Japan particularly, someone 45 years ago was a mortal military enemy, and there's still a lot of long memories. We still see various protests, people resistant to bring in Japanese plants, to bring the Japanese here, even the Chinese more recently. I mean, deep philosophical differences in our political and economic systems. Is that just a matter of time before we overcome that totally?
Well, I think that we have to overcome it because even though the Japanese are homogeneous people, I will never look at Japan as being monolithic again. Because the Japanese have to invest someplace else besides Japan. There's nothing, I mean, they don't have any room over there. So they have to take their money someplace else, and the best place to take it, of course, is this continent. So I don't think we deal with those kinds of issues up front. In the conversations we had, I do not believe that the Japanese deal with their aggressiveness. They're such a polite kind of people, and then you ask them, well, how could you possibly do Pearl Harbor?
They've been polite for centuries, but yeah.
I mean, and they're beating us to death either with military machines or economically, we perceive sometimes.
I think, John, your observation about their own potential to expand within is a very important part of what they're doing. Would be my guess that it is so expensive to build plants in Japan because of the small amount of land that's available that they almost can't do that. They also, it came out in our discussions, have a tremendous labor shortage, and they can't find qualified people and have to give a lot of benefits that I probably wouldn't have thought of them giving to even get competent help. So they have some problems.
Larry, quickly, I think the way we overcome the past is that we have to be more honest about our relationships. And I think we have to take our issues to the Koreans and the Japanese, and they have to be up front with us, too.
And part of that is the person-to-person type of relationships that a sister city program can build, because it's really much easier to want to work and cooperate and learn from someone that when you stay in their home and sleep on their floor and eat sushi. All of a sudden, the way that you look at a different culture is very personal, and it's not necessarily historic. It has nothing to do with anything other than two people who really have a great deal in common and who've developed some friendships. And that's why those kinds of relationships are extremely important.
Well, and I think both of those societies, the personal relationships mean more in both the Japanese and Korean societies than they do in our own. They build everything on personal relationships.
Yeah, relationships. Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that I learned from my host family was that the values that my parents had and the values that his parents had.
And what we don't have is time. John, I'm sorry we're out. John Rouse, Rob O'Brien, thank you. Barbara Underwood, John Bowles for being with us here today. I'm Larry Lough. See you next week on Public Affairs Roundtable.
Public Affairs Roundtable is produced in the studios of WIPB Channel 49 on the campus of Ball State University. The producer is John Rouse. Listener comments are welcome.